As you are aware, this week I'm discussing the Indian philosophy. In the previous episode, I talked about the Charvaks, the materialist worldview, and today I'm going to talk about Jainism or Jaina Dharma. At this point, at the risk of repeating myself, I would like to highlight a couple of interesting points about Indian philosophy. The first thing that we must remember at all times is that in Indian traditions, there's not much difference between religions and philosophy or philosophical schools. Generally speaking, when you talk about religions, you talk about gods, you talk about scriptures, you talk about some specific answers in terms of the nature of reality, moral principles, etc. But when you talk about philosophy, you don't find straightforward answers, but a set of tools that make you think, allow you to find your own answers. And although inevitably you come to certain predictable answers, but still the process is way different. The idea of philosophy is to engage in arguments, to persuade the other person through reasoning before finding an answer. And the process of religion is giving the answer and then believing in it. In most of these Indian, call them religions or philosophical schools, you find this approach of philosophy, that they are giving you reasons, they are giving you a set of tools with certain assumptions, of course, and then based on those assumptions you are proceeding ahead and then you're finding your answers. This is exactly what Buddhism does, Jainism, or any other school of thought. So that's one point. The other point worth remembering is that even if you consider them religions, they are very different from traditionally what we describe religions. Because once again, as I said, when we talk about religions, two things that come to our mind straight away is the idea of God and the idea of a scripture. Now, coming to Indian traditions, you may find one, you may find both, or you may find neither, as in the case of Charvaks. And for example, in case of Jainism and Buddhism, there is no idea of God. So that's what makes these traditions really, really interesting. So let's begin with Jainism or Jaina Dharma. I'm assuming most of you wouldn't know about Jainism, and especially if you live outside India, probably you haven't heard of this religion. It constitutes a very small percentage of the population, probably around 0.1, 0.2% of the global population. Most of the Jains, they live in India and they follow the teachings of Jain teachers, most notably Mahavir Jain, also known as Vardhaman. Some people consider him as the founder of Jainism, but most Jains don't think this is the case. He seems to be the 24th teacher in the long line of what they call Tirthankaras. These were the perfect teachers, perfect souls, or perfect guides who carried on the legacy of Jainism. And if you were to just understand Jainism in one sentence or in a very, very short way, quick way, then I would say it's simply a religion of non-violence. I mean, this is the central idea of Jainism, that you do not harm others. You do not harm any animal, any human being, any living creature. That's really the central idea of Jainism. But before we get to that, we need to get to the details and how we arrive at that conclusion that we should not harm others according to Jainism. What are the metaphysical principles? What are the underlying assumptions here that Jains are making this case? So let's start with the basics and how Jains view the reality. According to their view, there is clear distinction between the two worlds. One is called the jiva, the living world, the animate substances, and the ajiva, the inanimate substances. So there are life forms, and then there are lifeless forms. And this idea of life is considered sacred. So what they believe is everything that has life in it, consider a plant, a flower, an animal, an insect, a human being, all of them, they have the souls. Now what this soul is like, it's not really a static or an eternal idea as you find in Hinduism. It is changing. But it's also not really changing all the time, just as you find in Buddhism that everything is changing all the time. No, it is somewhere in between. So the idea of soul is that it is permeating through the living bodies, and then it is expressing itself through these bodies. So the soul of an insect, let's say, is not really the soul of a human being. It's slightly different. But nevertheless, it is the soul. On the other hand, if you talk about the Vedantic view, there you'll find that soul is more like the light. It is illuminating the world, and it is illuminating in different ways, of course. But it is still the same, the eternal. Here, the soul is getting affected by its karma, and therefore going through this journey of one life after another until it gets emancipated. And that's really the optimistic view of Jainism, that there is a way to emancipate the soul. And through your actions, through your deeds, you can do that. And because every soul has that potential, whether that is in you, that soul, or even in water molecules, or in plants, even in case of earth, where it is considered that the soul is more or less in a dormant state. But every soul has that potential to liberate itself from the karma, the cycles of karma, and therefore we must not hurt any soul. And that really becomes the central idea of Jainism. We must not hurt any living thing. And that can be a small animal, that can be a tree, that can be a human being. That is why, needless to say, all the Jains, as long as they follow the core tenets of Jainism, they are vegetarians. They in fact don't even cut a tree, and they try not to hurt any living organisms, whether it's a mosquito or a chicken or even a human being, of course. Another central message that we get from Jainism is that of Anekantavad, which means that there is not just one perspective, but many. There is not just one truth, but many. And that does not mean that there is not ultimate reality or the ultimate truth. But what Jains suggest, that because of our own limitations, because of our own sense organs, our own limitations of our mind, our brains, our physical bodies, we cannot really see the reality as it is. While normally speaking, we think that we are perceiving the reality through our senses, Jains believe that these senses are somehow hiding or filtering out the reality as well. And once the soul gets free from the body, it can then experience the reality. But as long as it is trapped in a body, it's very hard to make sense of the ultimate reality. And in some way, it makes sense. It's reasonable because when you think about it, you can have the access to certain spectrum of light or audio frequency. You don't have access to everything out there in the universe. There are so many things that you can't see, so many things that you can't hear, but they are there. You can't observe them because you have limited perceptions. And that's the point of an ekantavad, that because of our limitations, we cannot have the ultimate truth. And therefore, we must be humble enough to accept other people's point of view. They may be seeing a different reality based on their own assumptions, based on their own limitations. And this story of Anekantavad and the story of many perspectives, it comes often, especially in Jainism, in the form of the story called Five Blind Men and an Elephant. So the story goes something like this. There were five blind men, and then one day there comes an elephant to the village, and they all start observing that elephant. And since they were blind, they could not see the elephant. They go and touch the elephant, different parts of it, and based on their own experience, they come to different conclusions about the elephant. The one who is touching the trunk of the elephant, he says, the elephant is like the branch of a tree. And there's another one who's holding the leg of the elephant. He says, no, it can't be true. The elephant is like the pillar. And there is another person who's at the center and touching the body of the elephant. He says, but the elephant is more like a wall, a big wall. And somebody who's touching the tail of the elephant, he says that elephant is like a rope. And yet the fifth one, who is touching the elephant's ears, he says, but the elephant is like a fan. Now they all start arguing, debating among themselves about the reality of elephant, and they all have their own convictions based on their own experience. And then one fellow comes who can see the elephant, and then he tells them about the elephant, what it is like, and how they all of them are true to some extent, but they are not able to see the whole reality. And that's why they're mistaking their own view as the ultimate reality. And that's the point here, that we all have different conceptions of reality. In some cases, even different conceptions of, let's say, afterlife or the idea of God. But what we must remember at all times is that our view is limited because of our own limited abilities. And we must listen to others, consider their points of views, and then assess them, rather than asserting only our own assumptions and beliefs. Now, let's briefly talk about how Jains view the idea of God. As stated earlier, Jains do not really believe in the idea of one supreme God or something like that, but they do believe in the souls, in how karma works, and how souls can be liberated from this cycle of life and birth. Now, the first thing, the Jains, they point out that God's existence or the God's idea is based not on perception, but mostly on inference. Because nobody can truly claim that they've seen God. It's mostly they hear from other people or the testimonies of other people. And that will always be doubtful and in some cases unwarranted. And as you see, it's not very difficult to make arguments for atheism. For example, when somebody points out that the world is a kind of a creation and a creation must have a creator, it's not really difficult to counter that claim by suggesting that if everything needs to have a creator, in that case, God also needs to have a creator, and where is that? So you get into this endless cycle of questioning where you can easily refute the idea. And that is pretty much what the Jains do. And similar arguments you find in Jain teachings and their scriptures. For example, many theists argue that God is omnipotent, eternal, and perfect. But Jainas, they argue that if this is the case, then God should be the cause of all things. But that is not true. We see in our ordinary lives, whenever, let's say, we are creating something, we are building a house, it's not God that is creating those things, it's we. And we are responsible for those things. So, if you see it in this way, if God is behind everything, in that case, your own actions won't bear any fruit, because whatever you do, good or bad, eventually God is behind those actions. And whatever you do not bear any responsibility for those actions. And that's the kind of argument that's very, very hard to counter. But then this is the interesting point, and that is something unique about Indian philosophical schools, that although some of them do insist on atheism, they still suggest the spiritual path, and they suggest that there can be spirituality without an idea of religion or God. And Jainism does exactly that. In fact, Jainism doesn't even stop you from prayers, worships, all those things that are there in any other religion. You do pretty much that. In fact, that is the same thing with Buddhism as well. You don't really believe in the idea of eternal God, but then you still do those things. You still worship, you still do your prayers, you still pursue that spiritual path, and at the same time you follow that good ethical life, moral life. But you do that without any conception of heaven or hell or things like that. You do practice these things based on the idea of karma, based on your compassion towards other living things, and your own willingness to set high moral and ethical standards. So that was some brief introduction about Jainism, and in the next podcast I will talk about Buddhism. At the same time, I will talk about certain core concepts of Indian philosophy which are pretty much applicable in different schools. For example, this idea of karma. It's not really as straightforward as it seems first, and therefore we must take time to understand it and discuss it. Also, there are a couple of books that I'm reading to extract these basic ideas of Indian philosophy. One is an introduction to Indian philosophy by Satish Chandra Chatterjee, and the other is Fundamentals of Indian Philosophy by Ramakrishna Puligandala. So these two books I'm reading these days, although I would say in these two and a couple of other books that I've read, the content doesn't really vary that much. And probably that's the tragedy of Indian philosophy, that whatever work that was done hundreds and thousands of years ago in this philosophy, it hasn't changed much. New philosophers in recent times, they haven't added too much value, they haven't really diversified these ideas. And that could probably be attributed to this idea that religion is very much tied to these philosophical schools. And therefore, there's not too much freedom to change those views. But then the same can be said about other philosophers. For example, Socrates or Aristotle, their views are still their views. And they haven't really changed because they can't really. So that's the idea with these philosophical schools. They are a result of sophisticated thinking, years and years, even centuries of hard work, along with some profound wisdom. So that's all for today. In the next episode, as I said, I'll catch you and discuss the basics of Buddhism.